Captain Ivan Sokolov arrived at the station at 1:40 a.m. on January 23, when the sun had already touched the tops of the larches, turning the snow into a shadowless grey mass. The truck stopped in front of a barbed wire gate strung between 4 posts, and a guard in a sheepskin coat checked his documents without looking Sokolov in the face. Beyond the gate stood 3 barracks covered in tar paper, 1 isolation cell with a reinforced door, and a low, windowless building marked on the map as a medical block. Sokolov emerged from the cab, clutching a folder with orders, and felt the cold penetrate his overcoat and settle like a heavy lump in his lungs. The station commander, Major Krivtsov, met him at the entrance to the administrative barracks and immediately led him inside, not allowing him to remove his hat. Inside, the air smelled of kerosene, tobacco smoke, and something sour that Sokolov couldn't identify. Krivtsov laid out 3 typewritten sheets of text on the table, partially crossed out in red pencil, and explained that the detainee had been in the detention center for 11 days, that the doctor had refused to sign the medical report, and that Moscow was demanding a final classification within 48 hours. Sokolov skimmed the text and saw terms that weren't used in any protocol he knew: bone structure discrepancy, absence of identifiable speech organs, reaction to light without visible pupils. He asked where the detainee had been taken from, and Krivtsov replied that a group of hunters had encountered him 8 kilometers north, near an abandoned geological camp, and that he had no documents on him. Sokolov closed the folder and said he would begin the examination in the morning, but Krivtsov shook his head and explained that the detainee wasn't sleeping, eating, or responding to voices, but was making noises every night that caused the guards to leave their posts. Sokolov sensed the tension in the barracks become physical, like the pressure before a thunderstorm, and agreed to conduct an initial inspection immediately. They crossed the courtyard to the isolation cell, and Krivtsov opened the lock with a ring of 7 keys, each turning with a metallic grinding sound. Inside, a single overhead lamp glowed, and by its light, Sokolov saw a figure sitting on a bunk against the far wall. The figure was the height of a normal man, but the proportions were off. The limbs seemed too long, the head too narrow, and the posture unnaturally still, like a mannequin left in the wrong position. Sokolov took a step forward, and the figure turned its head without moving its shoulders. It had no eyes in the traditional sense, only 2 sockets from which emanated a faint, almost imperceptible glow, like a damp surface in the dark. Krivtsov remained by the door, and Sokolov realized the major would not go any further. He pulled out a notebook and began jotting down notes. No visible breathing, no response to temperature, gray skin with a bluish tint, uneven texture. He approached another meter, and the figure stood up, not supporting itself with its arms, in a single, fluid movement that defied human biomechanics. Sokolov stopped, and at that moment, he realized he should have insisted on a doctor's presence, but he couldn't back down without questioning his own qualifications. The next morning, Sokolov demanded a physical examination using medical instruments, and Krivtsov assigned him 2 soldiers and a paramedic named Gromov. Gromov was young and nervous, and when they entered the detention center, he had his hands in the pockets of his robe, clutching something inside. The detainee sat in the same position as the day before and didn't move when Sokolov ordered the soldiers to secure him to the bunk with metal clamps. The soldiers approached reluctantly, and one of them, Private Tarasov, stopped 2 steps away, looking at the detainee's limbs, which ended not in fingers but in something like flattened growths without nails or joints. Gromov tried to take his pulse on his wrist but couldn't find an artery. He moved his fingers to his neck, then to his chest, shaking his head each time, not meeting Sokolov's gaze. Sokolov ordered him to use a stethoscope, and Gromov placed the diaphragm on the detainee's chest, listened for about a minute, then stepped back and said there was no heartbeat, but something else, a low-frequency vibration that neither stopped nor accelerated. Sokolov wrote this down in the report and added that the vibration could be the result of involuntary muscle contractions, although he himself didn't believe this explanation. He ordered Gromov to take a tissue sample from his forearm, and the paramedic pulled out a scalpel. But when the blade touched the skin, it didn't cut through, but slid off, leaving a white scratch that disappeared within seconds. Gromov tried again, pressing harder, and the scalpel broke at the base, leaving a short fragment in his hand. The detainee didn't flinch or make a sound, but the sockets where his eyes should have been grew darker, as if the light inside them had gone out. Tarasov retreated to the door, and the second soldier, Leontiev, followed him without waiting. "Order!" Sokolov shouted for them to stop, but they left, and the door slammed shut with a metallic clang. Gromov dropped the broken scalpel and said he couldn't continue, that this was neither a human nor an animal, and that a medical examination was impossible without an understanding of basic biology. Sokolov replied that the examination would be completed regardless, and that Gromov would sign the report by the end of the day, otherwise his report would be sent to Moscow with a note indicating his refusal to perform his official duties. Gromov left, and Sokolov was left alone in the cell. He sat down on a stool by the door and began writing his report, but after a few minutes, he realized he couldn't find wording that would both reflect reality and not raise questions from the examiners. He wrote, "The detainee exhibits atypical physiological characteristics requiring additional analysis using specialized equipment," and realized that this phrase meant nothing, but bought him time. That night, at 10:30 p.m., a guard ran into the administrative barracks and reported noises coming from the isolation cell. Sokolov got dressed and crossed the courtyard, and as he approached, he heard a low, monotonous hum that seemed to come not from his throat, but from the walls of the building itself. He opened the door, and the hum ceased instantly, leaving behind a silence that left his ears ringing. The detainee stood against the far wall, facing the corner, and didn't move, even as Sokolov approached. Sokolov reached out to touch his shoulder, but pulled it back at the last moment, feeling a chill emanating from the figure, not an ordinary chill, but something that sucked the warmth from the ear and from his body. On the morning of January 25th, Gromov disappeared. He wasn't at roll call, his belongings were left in the barracks, and the door to the medical block was open from the inside. Krivtsov organized a search, and 2 hours later, the soldiers found Gromov 800 meters from the station, in a snow-covered ravine. He was lying on his back, looking up at the sky, and his face showed no signs of fear or pain, only a blank, detached expression, like that of a man who has stared too long at something he shouldn't have seen. He was alive, breathing regularly, but unresponsive to voices, light, or touch. They carried him to the barracks and laid him on a cot, but he kept his eyes open and didn't move, and by evening his breathing had become shallow, almost imperceptible. Sokolov demanded an explanation from Krivtsov, and the major pulled a folder marked Top Secret from his safe, containing reports from other stations operating under similar protocols. Sokolov read the first report and saw that in October 1937, a subject with identical characteristics had been detained at a police station in Karelia. The examination was interrupted after 2 soldiers refused to enter the detention center, and the subject was destroyed by fire without a final report being prepared. The second report described an incident in the Arkhangelsk region, where a detainee had been transported to a closed medical facility, but the convoy failed to arrive, and the vehicle was found abandoned on the side of the road with the engine running and the doors open. Sokolov closed the folder and asked why this information hadn't been passed on to him immediately, and Krivtsov replied that orders from Moscow required an independent assessment without regard to previous cases, to avoid skewed conclusions. Sokolov realized he was being used as a test, a control element in an experiment whose results were already known in advance, and that his report was supposed to either confirm the previous findings or refute them, but in either case, not change the overall decision. He returned to the detention center and ordered Tarasov and Leontiev to transfer the detainee to the medical unit, where a more detailed examination could be performed using the X-ray machine delivered to the station 3 months earlier. The officers entered, placed handcuffs on the detainee, which were too wide for his wrists, and led him toward the exit. The detainee walked obediently, without resistance, but when they reached the porch, he stopped and turned his head toward the barracks where Gromov lay. Tarasov tugged his arm, and the detainee continued walking, but at that moment, Sokolov noticed that no tracks had been left in the snow behind him, despite his heavy walk, using his entire foot as weight. In the medical unit, the detainee was laid on a table, secured with straps, and Sokolov turned on the X-ray machine. The tube hummed, the screen lit up, but no image appeared, only a white haze, uniform across the entire area, without a single dark spot. Sokolov increased the exposure, repeated the shot, and the result remained the same. He turned off the machine, walked over to the table, and looked at the detainee, who lay motionless, staring blankly at the ceiling. Sokolov realized that inside this body there were no bones, no organs, nothing that could stop the radiation, and that everything he had seen up to that point was a shell, imitating form but containing no structure. He left the block and ordered Krivtsov to call specialists from Moscow, but the major. He said that contact with the center had been lost the previous evening, that the radio station was working, but all messages were going unanswered, and that the last telegram received had demanded that he complete the operation himself and send a report as soon as possible. Sokolov realized they were isolated, that he had to make the decision, and that any choice would be recorded in documents that no one would read but would remain in the archives forever. Sokolov returned to the administrative barracks, locked the door from the inside, and unfolded a map of the area on the table, showing the marks of geological expeditions over the past 5 years. He found the spot where the hunters had found the detainee and saw that 3 disappearances had been recorded within a 20-kilometer radius, 2 workers and 1 guide who had gone on a reconnaissance mission and never returned. Official reports attributed this to bear attacks, but the attached diagrams contained no descriptions of tracks or remains. He heard footsteps on the porch, and the door opened without a knock. Krivtsov entered, holding a metal box bound in iron. The major placed the box on the table and explained that it contained samples collected from the disappearance sites, and that these samples had not been sent to Moscow for reasons Sokolov should understand. He opened the box, and Sokolov saw 4 glass jars filled with a clear liquid, in which floated fragments of grey tissue with a bluish tint. The tissue was identical to what he had seen on the detainee, but the fragments were too small, too uniform, as if they had not been cut out, but had separated on their own. Krivtsov said that all 3 missing persons were found later, at different times, in different places, but each time with identical changes. He pulled a photograph from the folder, and Sokolov saw a body lying on a metal table, a body with normal human proportions, but with skin that had lost its pigment and texture, turning into a grey, smooth surface without pores or hair. The photograph showed that the eyes were missing, leaving 2 indentations in their place, using the same clear liquid as in the jars. Sokolov put the photograph aside and asked why this hadn't been reported immediately, and Krivtsov replied that the first 2 cases had been classified as the result of exposure to an unknown toxin, that the 3rd case had aroused suspicion, but by then the detainee had already been delivered to the station, and orders from Moscow required continued observation. Sokolov realized they weren't apprehending a dangerous criminal or conducting a medical examination. They were containing a source of distribution that had already begun to act, and that Gromov wasn't the first to be exposed. He went to the barracks where the paramedic was lying and saw that the skin on his hands had become pale, that his nails had taken on a grey tint, and that dark spots had appeared in the corners of his eyes, which hadn't been there that morning. Gromov remained unresponsive to external stimuli, but his lips moved, silently repeating the same motion, as if he were trying to pronounce a word that was inaudible. Sokolov returned to the holding cell and stood before the detainee, who sat on the bunk in the same position as the first day. He asked out loud, without expecting an answer, what was going on, and the detainee raised his head, looking straight at him with the hollows where his eyes should have been. Sokolov felt a chill run down his spine and realized the detainee wasn't a prisoner. He was an observer, waiting for the process to be completed, and that each day spent at the station increased the range of his influence. He emerged and gave the order to prepare the detainee for execution by fire, as had been done in Karelia, and Krivtsov nodded without asking any questions. An hour later, a pit was dug in the yard, logs soaked in kerosene were placed at the bottom, and the detainee was led out of the cell, accompanied by 4 soldiers with rifles. He walked calmly, without resistance, and when he was lowered into the pit, he lay down on the bottom, arms folded across his chest, like a corpse in a coffin. Krivtsov threw down a match, the kerosene ignited, and flames engulfed the body. But the detainee didn't scream or move, and after a few minutes, when the fire reached its maximum temperature, Sokolov saw that the body wasn't charring, but slowly dissolving, turning into a grey liquid that flowed down, soaking into the ground. The flames extinguished themselves, without water, and at the bottom of the pit there remained neither bones nor ashes, only a dark stain on the frozen ground. Sokolov wrote his report that night, sitting in the cold barracks by the light of a kerosene lamp. He wrote that the detainee had been liquidated in accordance with protocol, that a medical examination had confirmed the presence of atypical characteristics of biological origin, and that further study was inadvisable due to the absence of the subject. He didn't mention Gromov, didn't mention the disappearances, didn't mention the photographs or samples in the metal box. He signed the document, stamped it, and handed it to Krivtsov for dispatch at the first opportunity. Gromov died the next day without regaining consciousness. His body was wrapped in a blanket. The remains were found and buried outside the site's perimeter, unmarked on the map. 2 soldiers, Tarasov and Leontiev, requested a transfer to another site, and Krivtsov granted them without question. Communication with Moscow was restored a week later, and a short telegram arrived: report accepted. Site is to be mothballed. Personnel are to be redeployed. No further instructions were forthcoming. Sokolov left the site in mid-February, when the snow had already begun to settle in the sun and the road became passable. He returned to Moscow, submitted a report on the end of his assignment, and was transferred to another position, an administrative one, in the office, without field visits. He no longer received assignments related to the Taiga Protocols, and no one asked him about the events of January. His name remained in archival documents, on folders that no one opened, and on seals that no one checked. 3 months later, he received a letter from a former colleague who worked in the archival department. The letter stated that the site where the operation had taken place had been completely dismantled, all the buildings burned, and the area covered with earth and fenced with unmarked barbed wire. The letter also mentioned that the geological teams working in the area had been recalled, and that a 50-kilometer radius of the former site had been declared closed to all economic activity. Sokolov didn't respond to the letter. He continued working, signing documents, and attending meetings, but every night before falling asleep, he saw a figure standing by the wall of the isolation cell and heard a low, monotonous hum that seemed to come not from a throat, but from the earth itself. He didn't tell anyone about it, didn't write it down in his diary, and didn't try to explain it to himself. One day, at the end of May, he was walking down Tverskia Street and saw a man in the crowd with a grayish tint, an empty gaze, and a strange, unnatural gait. The man passed by, unnoticed, and disappeared into the stream of people. Sokolov stopped and turned around, but the crowd had already closed in, and it was impossible to tell whether this man was real or just a reflection of what remained inside. He continued walking, his hands in his pockets, and didn't look back. He knew that the report had been accepted, that the station was closed, that the case was closed. He knew that no one would ask questions, and that no one would seek answers. But he also knew that the body hadn't burned in the pit doused with kerosene, but had dissolved, absorbed into the earth, and that the earth there remained dark and damp, and that in the spring, when the snow melted, nothing would grow there.